KZSU-FM Stanford, welcome to another edition of Hearsay Culture. My name is Dave Levine. I'm an associate professor at Elon University School of Law, as well as an affiliate scholar at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School. I'm very excited today to have on Stanford University's Paul Saffo. We are in a time where the future is unknown, or perhaps bleak, or perhaps is full of opportunities. And so it's probably a both apt and challenging time to have one of the leading forecasters on Hearsay Culture today. Paul is known for his work focusing on hyper-dynamic scenarios involving long-term changes and giant organizations. And so perhaps no time better than now exists to have someone like Paul on. In fact, he teaches forecasting at Stanford and chairs the Future Studies and Forecasting track at Singularity University. He has many affiliations, including with the Atlantic Council, and he is a fellow of the Royal Swedish Academy of Engineering Sciences. He serves on a variety of boards, has been published virtually everywhere. And frankly, if you're paying attention to trying to figure out where the world is headed over the last 20 plus years, you would be hard pressed not to run into Paul's work. What we face today is something which, again, is a problem. Are many problems that have come together at a unique moment in society. It's very tempting, it seems, to dismiss all of these problems as the subject of a given president or the subject of a given age, or to use labels like millennials that are often used to describe demographic groups. But things seem to be a lot more complex. And so today on Hearsay Culture, we're going to have a wide-ranging but really focused discussion on what forecasting is, how we might apply it today, and how you as a listener might be able to use some of the methods, some of the skills, and some of the insights perhaps that Paul offers today to try to navigate this unprecedented challenge. On a quasi, I guess, optimistic note, Paul, I'll thank you for being on the show. We are recording on Monday, June 29th, 2020. I am in my home studio temporarily in Tucson, Arizona. Paul, I believe, is somewhere in the Bay Area. We can leave it at that, and perhaps in his office. But thank you for joining us via Zoom today.
Yep, my pleasure. And like everybody else, I'm in my home office.
That's right. There's really nowhere else to be. So let me jump right in, Paul, with a question that I'm sure you get all the time. Right? What is forecasting, and how is it different from predicting the future, or being a seer, or having a crystal ball?
Well, they have a lot in common. I prefer the word forecaster, but I've pretty much failed at avoiding being called a futurist, so I'm often called futurist. It's human nature to look into the future, and it's a really good idea to look into the future. We're all here today because each of us has an unbroken line of ancestors who were really good at being able to anticipate what might be over the next hill or behind that large tuft of grass, and they thus lived long enough to reproduce. So it's something we all do, and there are lots of different ways to do it. For me, forecasting is a term that I prefer just because it takes a lot of the emotion and mystery out of the process. At the end of the day, forecasting is merely systematically applied common sense.
What do you make of the view that says that someone that focuses on data or evidence will merely tell you what it is that's happening now, but will refuse to tell you what might happen? And I had that very conversation with Manuel Castells several years ago, where he all but adamantly refused to do anything approaching what might happen next.
Well, yeah, I greatly admire Manuel Castells and his work, so I'm sure not going to disagree with him. I'm very happy to wade into areas of high uncertainty and offer speculation about what might happen. And the way I look at things, this isn't about predicting outcomes. It is about mapping a cone of uncertainty. that extends out from the present. And again, it's common sense. There's formal method to what I do, but at its heart, it's the same thing we all do. The point of looking into the future isn't to predict what will happen, but to anticipate the full range of possible outcomes. So you can then take steps to have an influence on what eventually should occur or arrive. And you can help deflect events away from something that's undesirable or nudge them towards something that is desirable.
Without revealing any of your trade secrets, and I am a trade secret scholar, would you share a little bit of what your method is as a general matter applying forecasting?
Excuse me. Well, I mean, there's, boy, I have a couple of simple rules of thumb that you should always follow on forecasting. One of them is don't allow what you hope will happen to interfere with your judgment of what you think will happen, and to be somewhat detached. In this sense, what I do is as much a branch of anthropology as it is of mathematics. You know, the good Reverend Bayes has been very good to me in my work, and I use quantitative methods all the time, but it really is a process of, you know, deep interviewing. I rely a lot on experts. So, for example, noting the current COVID pandemic, that my students last quarter, I started them very early in the quarter, and the quarter started on, January 6th. I said, there's this thing brewing, and we're going to do a forecast of this virus because the experts I talk to say there's a very good chance it's going to turn into a global pandemic. I'm just a forecaster. I'm not a virologist. I'm not an expert, but I have a lot of friends who are experts, and an expert friend of mine put me onto it in mid-December. So it is, a lot of it is just deep listening to what's passing through the zeitgeist.
Which of course is a topic we'll get to later, which is the amount of noise that exists within our information ecosystem. You alluded to it, and of course, stating the obvious, we're facing an unprecedented pandemic. Given COVID, what is changing in how we consider our ability to forecast?
Well, for starters, this was the single most, well, it's tied. There are two events in my 30-year career as a forecaster that have been more predicted and more anticipated than any other events. And this pandemic was one of them. I have lost count of all of the exercises that I participated in with government agencies and others on pandemics. In 2012, for a project for the National Intelligence Council, Global Trends 2030, we had a whole chapter devoted to the pandemic. And I just happened to be looking at the notice of the discussion today, and it was saying, what is forecasted when the global pandemic comes, and how will that break up globalization? So anybody who says they predicted this, just write them off. They're idiots. Everybody predicted this. This pandemic is, and this is what makes forecasting tricky. This pandemic was not a failure of foresight. This is a failure of response, and not just in the United States, but elsewhere. So it's a systems problem. And by the way, the other single most predicted event is the next big quake in Silicon Valley, but that's another story.
Right.
And for me as a forecaster, I live up in the hills behind San Mateo, so I'm about a mile and a half from the fault. Our house is in the highest fire risk zone in the state. We have deer mice on the property, which means I probably have hantavirus pooled on the property. I got at least 3 of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse on my property, which seems only appropriate for a forecaster.
Well, to commiserate with you, I can look out my window right now and visibly see the Tucson fires that have been raging over the last several weeks. So I can share that at least with you. Let me push it a little bit on this point. You referred to the COVID situation as a systems failure. What do you mean by that? What has failed us in your view if it isn't the ability to anticipate this problem?
Well, it's a failure of politics. It's a failure of policy and implementation. China, after SARS, set up what they thought was a politician-proof surveillance system. And what we discovered is it was not politician-proof, and that the local, the classic pattern in China, which has been true for, centuries, the local government officials did not want to displease their seniors, and so they found a way to hide the evidence of the spread. And so we lost time there. And of course, the problem, this is why I used it with the students in my class last quarter, is it's an exponential problem that you've got to stop these things early. Well, we can come back to it, but a perfect analogy are the wildfires that are out your window. In any case, so China failed to surveil it, and then everybody ran for cover to avoid taking responsibility. And then this administration in the United States went out of their way to utterly frustrate our response, to attack experts, to create all of the confusion that was created, which is utterly unavoidable. I've got to go get a COVID test tomorrow. And I know for a fact I would never have had to get that COVID test if our leaders had done their job. And if there are two people to blame for this, the two people are Xi and Trump. More than anybody else on the planet, those two individuals allowed politics to get into the way of policy and ideology to get in the way of good science. And that's why we have the problem. But that's what makes forecasting so interesting, that we, in all the exercises I did, we gamed out all sorts of scenarios. I do not recall a single forecasting exercise around a pandemic where we said the two top global leaders on the planet would do everything they could to frustrate an effective response.
Which I guess gets to, and accepting your analysis is accurate, and I'd be hard-pressed to dispute it, what is the purpose of forecasting if, in fact, the result of the forecast is, for lack of a better phrase, ignored? Is there any other reason to engage in this exercise if, as you point out, the people who are best positioned to do something with that information ignore it?
Right. So you have put your finger on the most painful part of forecasting. People say, well, it must hurt when you're wrong. And I say, well, actually, if I'm not wrong at least 3 times before breakfast, I'm not doing my job. Mm-hmm. Again, it's probing uncertainty. It's not predicting a specific outcome. No, the thing worse than being wrong is being right and being ignored. This is, the lament of Cassandra. The lesson there, don't date a god because they will put a curse on you. And Cassandra's curse was to be right and to be ignored. There have been lots of instances in my work where I've done a good forecast, but I've done a bad job of communicating it, and the advice wasn't taken. And that is vastly more painful than getting a forecast wrong. So forecasting does not stop with the forecast. The forecast is essential, but not sufficient. You then need to work with whoever the audience is to make them understand it. Years ago, I know one instance where it was about 25 years ago for a company, and we decided to the team decided to put the forecast as a novel, figuring it was more likely to get read as a novel. And everybody in senior management read it except the CEO. Everybody's lost, so they gave the novel to the CEO's spouse, and she read it, and she made sure it was on his bedtime side table, and he read it.
Again, I anticipated this, as I'm sure you did. It's really impossible to discuss the COVID situation without it sounding quote unquote political, although I'm not adverse to that. And so I want to follow up on this point. We are chatting with Stanford University's Paul Saffo on Hearsay Culture and KZSU-FM. So I saw John Bolton yesterday on the morning news programs, questioned by everyone with regard to the information he's now sharing in his book that will go unnamed on this show. And one of the things he said responded to with regard to why President Trump would tweet a tweet or a piece of information that has the phrase white power in it is that, according to Bolton, President Trump simply doesn't pay attention to a lot of things. And I am paraphrasing only slightly. We have right now, right, a situation where, as I just alluded to, we have a glut of information and we have others in power who don't pay attention. Right? And that may be generous, by the way. But the point is, and pushing on that, what do you do with the people who don't pay attention but should? Certainly, it seems like a clever and logical way to think about how to communicate the information in a way that will be engaging. And there's been plenty of reporting on how President Trump's staff, at least some, have tried to get him to pay attention. But what else can you do? Or is it ultimately a human choice, a human bias to ignore things because that's what we do?
Well, the ineffectuality of the pandemic response is an artifact of the state of our political system. And so really what we should be having is a conversation about how do we elect leaders and how do we have a conversation in our society. Civics hasn't been taught in high schools for a very long time. And our politics is such that people treat their party affiliation like a sports team rather than a actual serious policy conversation. So there's not much we can do about it. I mean, President Trump is not a leader of anything. He's like the snowflake that was resting on the edge of a ice cornice when the avalanche happened, and he just happens to be the snowflake in the front of the avalanche, but he's being swept along as much as everybody else. This is where we invoke that old Pogo cartoon where Pogo is standing up there and saying, "We have met the enemy and he is us."
Right.
That is absolutely true. This is what's going on. There's an information dimension to this as well, though, that our society, that each advance in telecommunications has made our country less governable. And so right now, a big part of that is because of the personal media revolution, we've really truly become ungovernable, and at least at certain levels are acting in an irrational fashion, electing leaders who are patently unqualified to hold the job.
And these are huge challenges that I do think forecasting, as you allude to, touches upon. You've written you've written several times about this idea of being careful about holding a strong position, to which you've already alluded. So how do you factor in strong positions held weakly? And
Sure.
What does that mean for purposes of forecasting?
It's one of my rule of thumbs, is strong opinions weakly held.
Yeah.
The way to come to a forecast, good forecasting is a process a little bit different than other fields, is if you're looking into uncertainty, you take the data you have and you come to a conclusion as quickly as possible, knowing that it is almost certainly wrong. And then you look for the additional data to systematically tear apart your conclusion and build a new conclusion. The way you get to a forecast, a good forecast, is to iterate through a lot of lousy forecasts and to speculate and not be afraid to throw something out the moment it doesn't fit. The problem with foresight is you can never have 100% information. And it's that question of mapping the cone of uncertainty. If you draw the cone too broadly, you're going to spend your whole time looking at data that's not relevant, in effect, boiling the ocean to get a cup of salt. On the other hand, if you draw the cone too narrowly, you're going to miss something and you're going to be surprised, and it might not be a good surprise. Well, the way you hone the edges of the cone, get the size right, is you come to conclusions, be your own harshest critic, come to a conclusion beyond.
I think this ties into your very well-known Harvard Business Review piece from 2007. You wrote, and this was, in the years soon after Y2K, you wrote, quote, "The result of the Y2K non-events was that many people subsequently rejected the possibility of other wildcards ever coming to pass. As a result," you wrote, "9/11, which was a much bigger surprise than it should have been." Does COVID change the math? I mean, this is a cataclysmic event where lots of changes are now happening. We're recording on June 29th, and just yesterday, the state of Mississippi agreed to remove the Confederate flag from its flag, and a concept, frankly, which I think was probably inconceivable even a month ago. Does COVID change the math in terms of rejecting possibilities?
Well, I think what what happened is that COVID's just so shocked people that it left them open to new possibilities. And the other aspect of this, Nils Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould had a theory of evolution they called punctuated equilibria. And the notion was that you'd have a period of stability and then rapid change to a new plateau of stability. Now, the evolutionary world has sort of questioned that, but I think it does apply in history and culture, that we have these moments of stability and moments of revolution and fast change. And COVID was the final straw that put us into a period where everybody's questioning everything, which is, by the way, proof of the old saying that there is no wind so ill that it does not blow some good. And for example, just this morning, I was talking to someone and they're talking about changing that it's time to change the name of the Los Padres National Forest. And my reaction was, that would be a good thing. The name's always made me uneasy, and to give it a name from the first peoples would be a good thing. Of course, it'll be a challenge because for those of you who don't live in California, the Los Padres National Forest crosses the historic territory of the Chumash, the Salinan, the Esselen, and the Costanoan. And long before the Spanish arrived, they always fought with each other. So now we'll have a big argument over who gets to name the national park. But that's exactly what we should be doing.
We're chatting with Professor Paul Saffo of Stanford University on KZSU-FM Stanford. Before we take a short break, Paul, let me ask you one more question kind of related to this, right? You've alluded to the fact that you are comfortable being wrong, and if you're not wrong repeatedly, something is wrong. You, however, Paul Saffo, right, are one of the leading forecasters in the world with perhaps the luxury of being more wrong and not having your credibility damaged. If for someone who is newer to forecasting or who is building a career, and I want to get to this later on, but I do want to ask you now, does that same math apply? In other words, can one start a career as a forecaster or enter this field with the same ability to make errors and still get work?
Well, your question presumes that I have any credibility to begin with.
Fair enough. Let's assume that for purposes of the question.
So, Well, also, the other thing that I think is really important is I don't advise people to become forecasters. Much more important is that everybody should add an element of foresight to their work, to their jobs. We all need to be forecasters. Mm-hmm. When I started in this business, forecasting was a specialty field, and it was, was done by specialists. These days, thanks to the rise of personal media and the access to information, anybody can be a forecaster. And it's much more important for everybody to have foresight as part of what they do every day, rather than become specialist forecasters.
We are chatting with Paul Saffo, and I'm going to take this short break here. KZSU is a nonprofit, non-commercial radio station at Stanford University that requires donations from listeners like you to continue its diverse programming. And I don't say that lightly in a time where tens of millions of Americans lack employment. However, if you do have the means and the willingness to make a donation, you can email our underwriting department at underwriting@kzsu.stanford.edu or go to our webpage. Regardless, I do hope that you continue to listen to KZSU and to support this station during a very challenging time. Paul, let's come back, for the second half of our program. And I want to come back to your Harvard Business Review piece, which again, I will put in show notes once the show posts. But here's another quote.
You put me at something of a disadvantage.
Yeah,
I don't think I've read it for.
I do. Well, the way, and I was going to say I'm gonna read you the quote because I don't think it's. I'm not trying to pull it out of context, and I'm also not trying to play gotcha here. So don't worry about that. What did you write on page 3? That's not what I'm
right.
Okay, here's the quote.
When, sir, did you stop beating your wife?
That's right. That's right. Exactly. Yes, the loaded question. Here's the quote. Linden Labs founders arrived on the scene with Second Life at the right time and with the right reason. That property ownership was a secret to success. And when I was reading through this piece, again, referencing Linden Labs, which is largely gone, and Second Life, which is not, depending on where you are, is forgotten. But here's my question. How much of timing is driven by luck, particularly given, right, the imperfections associated with forecasting? How much of Linden Labs, as an earlier example, or pick Zoom. Let's pick an example right now of an entity that, in a morbid way has benefited from timing. How much of timing is luck?
Well, it was Edison who famously was, a woman came up to him and said, "Sir, you've been so lucky." And he said, "It's amazing. You're so right. The harder I work, the luckier I get." Right. Timing is absolutely essential. That, windows open and windows close, or rather doors open and doors close, and you got to get in at the right time. Yeah, and let's just note that I don't know what else I said around Linden Labs, but Linden Labs in the form of Second Life ultimately failed. I think it's still around. Its founder went on to do high fidelity, and the trend, and this is where the macro and the micro need to be distinguished in foresight. The essential idea behind that was telecommunications for the last 100 years has been, for the most part, a magical pipe between physical locations. And what we're doing with cyberspace is it became a destination. And the initial wave with the web was it's a destination we looked at through the porthole of the windows on our computers. The sentiment behind Linden Labs and Second Life is that it's a destination we can actually occupy with avatars. And so Linden failed, and there hasn't been a big hit there yet, but it is, since then, has been this steady progression towards a world in which we will have immersive 3D environments that we occupy. And the pieces waiting to come in is, we need to keep improving virtual reality goggles so they don't, make us nauseous with time lag and the like. But the trend is definitely there.
The flash in the pan scenario, right, seems to be one that happens repeatedly, particularly in technology, right? I mean, countless, and this is true of businesses to be sure, but countless entities on the internet have come and gone. What do we do with flashes in the pan, right, as a forecaster?
They're indicators. Yeah. One of my great regrets is I do not have one of the pets.com sock puppets. But at the time when that happened, I went, "Oh, this is great." I didn't get around to getting it. That, excuse me, each of those little flashes is pushing us further into a revolution. And so, pets.com and all the online shopping failures were there, but look at how everybody's getting their groceries today. And I noticed just this morning that my Samoyed Tasha's dog food was hanging on our door in a bag from some sort of online service.
Right.
So you have to draw a distinction between the trend and the specific event. That an event can happen and fail, but it's still a powerful indicator that the trend is happening. It's a little bit like watching a plane try to take off a runway. If it's not a very good pilot, it'll take off and maybe settle back, but the whole idea is it's trying to get lift. And I find in general, that most successes in terms of opening up new fields, that most ideas in Silicon Valley take about 20 years to become an overnight success.
Mm-hmm.
And that period before takeoff is paved with one failure after another. And that, of course, is why Silicon Valley is so good at what we do, that we have a very nuanced view of failure and how to keep trying again if something fails, how to restart.
How much of, since you bring up Silicon Valley, I'm curious, in light of what you've said, how much of Silicon Valley's success as compared to just about any other area in the country or even the world, right, as technology centers, do you attribute to information sharing, to the ability and willingness of entities to, at least as compared to other parts in the United States, share more information?
That's a very perceptive observation. I think it's absolutely essential in Silicon Valley. The Asilomar Microcomputer Conference, which you, of course, know all about, and has been going on now for, I think, 40 years, is jokingly been referred to as Silicon Valley's oldest and longest running trade secret swap shop. I know of an instance once where an engineer at Intel was having troubles with a new piece of manufacturing equipment, and they weren't getting the yields they wanted. So he called a friend of his at arch rival National Semiconductor, said, "I'm having this problem. I know you guys got the machine about 6 months earlier. How'd you fix it?" And the gent at National gave him the answer, because he knew that next time the shoe would be on the other foot. So yes, intelligent leaking is, and information sharing is a very good thing for innovation.
Do you think that the same is true of the mobility of labor in Silicon Valley, that individuals not only share information but move around between entities? I have vivid and happy memories of having breakfast in a Hobie's in Mountain View that I was told by its owners had many meetings amongst titans of Silicon Valley in the 80s and 90s. And I would imagine that some of those meetings involved who was going to go where. Is it the same principle, or do you, or not?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's very much in the Valley's DNA.
Yeah.
It started with the so-called Traders 8, the engineers who left Shockley Semiconductor in 1957 and literally walked a couple of blocks down the street to found Fairchild. And everybody was shocked, and Wall Street was shocked, because one did not do this. Well, in Silicon Valley, that's of course what we did. And that mobility of being able to simply walk down the street and start something new is happens all the time. I mean, think about what we're talking on right now, Zoom. And Eric Yuan, who founded Zoom, was over at the was it WebEx, and literally walked down the street and started a direct competitor, and it's a whole lot better than WebEx.
Right. Let's turn to, and we have about 15 or so minutes left in the interview, Paul. We're chatting with Paul Saffo of Stanford University on KZSU-FM and Hearsay Culture. The internet. I know this is such a broad question, but I'm curious to get your kind of knee-jerk reaction. Has it helped us overall engage in forecasting, or is it the classic too much information that makes people it makes it impossible to predict or forecast, or makes it too difficult for people to engage in? What's your kind of knee-jerk reaction to what I recognize as an extremely broad and should be granular question?
It's a marvelous tool that also complexifies the environment. So net, it's probably no change from before for a forecaster, for the narrow sense of being a forecaster. It also makes it vastly more interesting to be a forecaster because this is a particularly dramatic chapter of the information revolution. And the most important tool I have as a forecaster is history, for several reasons. One, this is a process of social and technological change, and the details differ, but the processes of human nature are pretty consistent. The other thing too, of course, is everything has an antecedent. There is nothing that has ever happened that hasn't emerged out of something that happened before. So for me as a forecaster, the internet is a fabulous tool. It can be a challenge with teaching courses because you have to come up with ways to do stuff that the students can't just look up. But, you know, at this moment in time, if you think about it, the observation's been made by others, and I rely upon the work of Elizabeth Eisenstein and her magisterial 2-volume set on the history of printing. But this moment is so eerily similar to the advent of modern printing after Gutenberg's refinement of movable type in 1452. 1501 was Aldous' first modern book. It is amazing. The timing and the details are so eerily similar. So in that sense, it's kind of easy to be a forecaster.
The aspect of the internet that you espouse, right? The availability of information is getting a lot of pushback today, as you know, from folks that are viewing the internet as having empowered hate groups, as having empowered other negative forces, whether they be sex trafficking on the internet, and of course the pushback on speech platforms like Facebook and others to do more. What's your take on that broad policy issue? In other words, you know, the utopian vision of the internet as being this leveler for information access to some, right? And I think an increasing number is not so great.
This was all anticipated in the 1990s, and nobody wanted to listen. And that, quite simply put, some people just shouldn't be allowed to talk to each other. And we're going to figure out a way to do that. But it was, I forget his name, an executive at HP once told me, he said, you know, technology, when it arrives, it's like a wild animal. And we have to tame it and domesticate it. And we always automate the wrong things first. You know, we give everybody access, but we don't figure out how to control interactions. So we're going to sort this stuff out. We're going to find a way to control hate speech and the like. I'm an optimist.
Well, that's a nice segue, I think, into what I anticipated was going to be a difficult question, but maybe I'm wrong. What factors for COVID survival individually are now necessary that might otherwise have to be missed due to our current frenetic life with unprecedented challenges and overwhelming amounts of things to balance?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yes, let me rephrase it differently, right? When we look at our current state of affairs being unprecedented, it would seem that there are things that we might be able to do or things that we might be able to think about that would help us get on the other side of what right now to many people seems like an inextricably life-changing situation that will not ever allow society to return to normal. Assuming that view, what factors should people be thinking about now in order to make it through this challenging time?
Well, for starters, this will end, and we'll put this behind us. And it might be that we get a vaccine and the bit flips or like, but we're going to put it behind us. There will be another pandemic. The real issue here, I mean, the danger at this moment is everybody's over-focusing on the pandemic. What we need to focus on is, why did we respond so badly? That I see this moment in time as a race between exponentials. It's the happy exponentials of innovation racing against the exponential negative consequences of innovation. And the problem is that as a society, as a global society, we're responding way too slowly. So that's what we really need to do, is we need to do deep thinking about our global institutions. And we're at a moment in time where nation state power is waning, and the new political center, political, economic, governance sector for the planet is city-states. And it's absolutely inexorable. It's happening in real time. Part of this pandemic happened precisely because of that. And what makes me very nervous is that city-states cannot govern a globe. And so we're entering into a period of new uncertainty and political and governmental chaos. That's our task. We've got to figure out, I mean, to put it very simply, we need to figure out, how do we think like a civilization? How do we create a global civilization that is capable of tackling global problems? If we don't do that, nothing else will matter.
I assume, but I'll ask anyway, that you have you are dubious on the ability of existing international institutions like the UN, which is celebrating a pretty momentous anniversary
75th
right now. Exactly. Do you think these institutions, as they currently are constituted, have the ability to not only forecast where we're headed, but approach them effectively?
The UN does excellent work. The UN is kept from doing its work by the superpowers who won't allow it to do its job. You know, if their especially criminal act was our president's decision to cut off funding to the WHO and the like, that is just absolutely inexcusable. Some years ago, a French minister said to me, he said about the United States, yeah, the problem with the United States is it's too big to ignore, but too weak to make a difference. And that, unfortunately, is the world we're in, where our most powerful nations are all too big to ignore, but too weak to make a difference. And what we need is some sort of new organizational principle to start thinking like a single globe, because all of our biggest challenges today are global. The pandemic does not respect borders, and it doesn't care what your politics are. And the fact is that the people responding were responding first thinking in terms of territory, and secondly thinking in terms of political consequences. And so what the pandemic demonstrates is the issue is not public health, the issue is global governance. And we need to figure that out. It might, it's probably going to take a couple of more crises and perhaps a nuclear exchange or two before we figure it out, but we'll probably figure it out. I'm not so pessimistic as my good friend Martin Rees, who thinks that we're going to be lucky to last past 2050.
I trust, I hope that you're not forecasting a nuclear exchange at this point on Hearsay Culture.
Well, I'm not forecasting. I think it's more likely than not that someone's going to shoot off a bomb in anger in the next 20 or 30 years. I'd be kind of surprised if they didn't. But I don't think it's going to, it's not going to be a massive exchange between nations. Hopefully not.
Well, in light of that statement, maybe I should skip this question, but I still feel compelled to ask it. Should we expect rational individual behavior when so much of the world seems upside down?
At the end of the day, rationalism always works, and it eventually emerges. It just takes people some time to come around to it. Again, I'm fundamentally an optimist. It's always a big mistake to, whenever we're faced with uncertainty, everybody either forecasts we're headed into a new utopia or we're headed into doom and destruction. It's like cyberspace. When Bill Gibson coined the term and Silicon Valley adopted it in the early days of the web, everybody said, oh, this is great. It's going to be friction-free capitalism, this new nirvana. And others said, no, it's the doom of us all. And I looked at him and I said, no, I think it's more likely to be cyberbia. That it's not going to be the utopia. It's going to be like the world as it is, except online. So that's where we're at. It's that kind of world where we're going to muddle our way somewhere in the middle. But there is always a chance that somebody's going to do something really stupid and screw it up. And in an ever more deeply interdependent world, screw-ups have a funny way of propagating, just as a politician covering up a problem in Wuhan gave it time to escape and burn as an exponential fire that is affecting us all.
We're chatting with Paul Saffo, professor at Stanford University on KZSU-FM and Hearsay Culture. Paul, let me ask you a few closing questions, kind of kind of broader.
Sure, and I'm
yeah,
just important
yeah.
point. I'm an adjunct professor. I'm not a real professor.
Oh, excuse me. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I wasn't going to split hairs, but fair enough. Adjunct professor at Stanford. No, as someone
Big
on a
difference.
faculty, I appreciate that. That's a point. I have to regularly tell people I am a fellow at Stanford University and not a professor. That's a big difference. A much bigger difference than what you're describing. All right. So let me ask you a few things, just to kind of like, a little bit broader questions. This Hearsay Culture has covered books since its inception, and I'm curious, given that you are an avid reader and consumer of information, what should we be reading right now, and what are you reading?
Oh golly gosh, what am I reading? Let's see. I was just, the videos now. So I'm actually rereading James Fraser's The Golden Bough, which to me, I'm going deep on at the moment, in addition to work I do for clients and others, looking at the future of religion. And so going back to primary sources and looking at everything from Fraser's Golden Bough to academic studies of flying saucer cults. But yeah, there's so much to read. I don't know where I'd start on things to look at.
Yeah, it's which I guess is one of the blessings. But what advice, Paul, do you have for people? And I'm not talking about forecasting, excuse me, per se, but people starting their careers, forming a family, building their roots, given the challenges that we face today. As a forecaster, are there any core recommendations that you'd have for people trying to build their roots in such it's such a difficult time?
Well, it's important to remember, I think it was famously Joseph Campbell, who wrote The Power of Myth, and he came out of school during the Depression, and he retired to a cabin in upstate New York and spent several years in that cabin forming his basic theories. And so this is a good time, if one can, to get off by oneself and really do deep study, to take advantage of the moment.
And is that something that you think, given the challenges that exist today, is advice that can be applied uniformly? In other words, as you point to, if one is capable, we've got large segments of our society that are facing, as you know, excessive force issues involving law enforcement, not to mention COVID. Is there a way to give uniform advice with regard to these issues, given the widely different human experience that we face today?
Sure. That your question answers itself, that there is no one size fits all. But the important thing to keep in mind is quite often tools arrive just in time when they're most needed. And the tool this time is cyberspace. And imagine trying to do this home distancing before the AT&T breakup decades ago, or when we had 300 baud modems. And so what I'd be saying at this moment, whether you're an activist looking to solve an urgent challenge, or an academic looking to go deep into a field and build a new theory, you ask yourself, how can this most powerful tool, the internet in general, cyberspace, and the World Wide Web, help me? And then cyberspace matters for one reason above all other. And that is, in cyberspace, there is no distance between 2 points. And so you can literally be anywhere on the planet, and as long as you have good connectivity, you have access to this vast wealth of resources, of people, of information, of knowledge. And the question is, how do you use that effectively? Don't waste your time watching YouTube and TikTok. Do important work.
And it is, as the father of a soon-to-be 11-year-old and a 13-year-old boy who are inquisitive all the time, finding that balance. And again, I know you're not speaking about children per se, but I'm going to translate it to them. Finding that balance between my sons and their inquisitive minds and the fact that they are children and that they cannot grapple with all of these challenges. The aforementioned, I mentioned earlier, watching John Bolton yesterday morning, and my older son Noah says, Dad, what's going on with this guy who wrote this book? And I said, well, Noah, why don't you come and join me? You can listen to this interview that Jake Tapper on CNN was doing. And after about 5 minutes, I saw the look on Noah's face. He was scared. And I said, Noah, maybe now's not the time, and maybe this is not the right moment. And I think that applies to everyone, right? This need for self-preservation, right, in the face of these odds, and yet some people have to stand up because adults need to act. With that in mind, I'm going to do one more quote back to you, Paul, of yourself. But again, it's the same article for what that's worth. But also, this is a phrase that I think you are well known for, and my colleague and friend Howard Greenfield likes to say this. The best advice ever given to me, this is your writing, was by a rancher who reminded me of an old bit of folk wisdom. Quote, "Son, never mistake a clear view for a short distance," unquote. Okay. Now, how can we use that insight, right, for our progression as a society? Is that possible? Because obviously you were applying that to relatively narrow scenarios, but can we use that more broadly?
Well, the Linden Labs example you mentioned earlier is a case of where I didn't take my own advice. Mm-hmm. Linden Labs arrived, and it just seemed so obvious that that's the next thing that I thought it would succeed. And that sense of mistaking a clear view for a short distance, it's going to take a little bit longer before that arrives. So I think what I would say is not mistaking a clear view for a short distance in this moment in time means to actively engage in strategic patience, to understand that we're not going to solve the problem quickly, that we're going to have to be patient to lay down long-term solutions to help us avoid the same challenge coming back to us again. Because, of course, in the case of the pandemic, the thing that happens to be in the news at the moment, there are more pandemics in our future.
Paul Saffo, adjunct professor at Stanford University and leading forecaster. Thank you so much for joining us today on Hearsay Culture, sharing your wisdom. I invite you back in the future, hopefully maybe to take a look back a little bit and say, what can we learn from these experiences? But for now, thank you for joining us today and sharing your wisdom with my listeners.
Thank you.
I'm very excited on Hearsay Culture to note that we are, as I mentioned on previous shows, we are launching new programming and new interviews going forward. At this time, I can merely say stay tuned for what I think are going to be very exciting developments in the near future on Hearsay Culture, potentially new formats of interviews, as well as a broader range of issues. But for now, I'll simply say you can listen to Hearsay Culture on KZSU-FM Stanford. We are in a transition period coming up soon, but this past quarter, it's been Fridays at 8 p.m. Pacific time. You can also pick up Hearsay Culture via any of the podcasting applications that you use, as well as Apple iTunes. Keep in mind, of course, that I distribute the show through the Center for Human Society at Stanford Law School, so you can find it there. As always, I welcome your comments and suggestions and feedback at dave@hearsayculture.com or by going to the Hearsay Culture website. Meanwhile, I'll simply say thank you for listening in. Thank you for tuning in. Please stay tuned to KZSU for more diverse programming, and have a great day.